And the reason it's not an obvious draw, for example, if rook takes d1, rook takes d1, it might look drawish because after black moves his bishop out and then brings his rook to the d file and exchanges off the rooks, there's no real decisive threats for either side. But the reason it's not a draw is because black still has a weakness on g7, and white, if he doesn't take care, could still have problems with his h-pawn, which is a weakness as well. And also the advance of his queenside pawns has created weaknesses, you know, like their targets themselves, because they've advanced far and they've created weaknesses on the queen side, on the third rank especially. Also the movement of white's knight is restricted, because if it ever moves then the queen's gonna come down with strong threats. And the movement of white's queen is also fairly restricted, so it wouldn't be a clear-cut draw at all. The obvious move for black would be bishop e7, but then will come a much better time c5, and now the f7 pawn is the weakness. So to get back to the game anyway, after c5, Petrosian played one of his most celebrated moves, and if you want to try and spot it, then stop the video now. What he played was a5, and there are lots of reasons why this is such a great move. First of all, it's important to note that it's not acting in accordance with another of the teachings of Steinitz, which was that in such a position with the kings on the opposite side of the board, each player should be attacking the enemy king and absolutely avoid weakening pawn moves on the side of the board where they're being attacked. So what's Petrosian thinking of? Well, what he's noticed is that white's queenside pawns are fairly well advanced and thus in range of his pieces for attack, whereas Petrosian's own pawns are still on the baseline and thus they're difficult to attack. By playing a5, he undermines the support of the pawn on c5, and you know, it seems as though the position of his king would imply that such a pawn move was not a good idea, at least on the surface, you know, but realistically though, the king is not in any immediate danger, and the more important point to note is that the center is completely open and Petrosian has a better grip on it than Duckstein. By playing a5, he is planning to get his bishop to c5 here, which would guard his own king and at the same time play an attacking role against the white king, and also support a potential knight outpost on d4, which would be very strong. His queen is well placed on c7, where it's defending b7, while also eyeing the squares around white's king. So overall, what Petrosian has in mind by playing a5 is to stop white's pawn roller in its tracks, with, you know, these pawns marching down the board, and at the same time to take absolute control of the center, which is the first step towards dominating the entire board. Duckstein played rook a d1, as it's better to allow an exchange of pawns rather than initiate the exchange himself. For example, if he plays b takes a5 instead of rook a d1, then bishop takes c5 would be ideal for black, as the continuation a6, b6, a5, b5 achieves nothing and only blocks the lines into black's king. It would be completely safe there. So, after rook a d1, Petrosian played rook takes d1, which is much better than a takes b4, because that would just be an out and out blunder because of bishop e5. And after queen takes c5, rook takes d8 check, king a7, queen takes b4, and it's looking very bad for black. So rook takes d1 was the right move. Then came rook takes d1 and rook to h4, which is the move that Fritz recommended, and it's really the best move. It adds pressure to pawn on b4 and ensures, due to the open center, that the rook will have play on both sides of the board. So then came b takes a5 from Duckstein, But it's not really a good move. There are perhaps better variations for him to try. One is bishop c3, but it's a bit passive really, considering the position, just protecting that pawn again. A better try would have been queen d3, which gains greater central control and threatens things like queen d8, picking up the bishop. The only good move for black to play here would be king a7. If he plays bishop e7 instead, he really loses a tempo later in the game, because the bishop could have developed to a better square. So, after king a7, there would then come knight takes f5. And here there's a couple of continuations. Firstly, queen takes h2 check, king f1, g takes f5, queen d8, queen to h1 check, king e2, rook to e4 check, king d2, and queen takes g2. And taking the bishop here would be very unwise for white, as the resulting attack for black would be far too strong. White does have a draw here with perpetual check if he wants it, but it's really unclear if he could play for anything more than that. The other continuation, after knight takes f5, is g takes f5. The best play there is queen d8, queen takes d8, rook takes d8, rook takes b4, rook takes f8, rook takes b2, h4, and it's fairly unclear here as an endgame, but overall it should favour black. So it seems, as usual, Petrosian had seen very deeply into the position and ensured that either the game would be drawn or he would end up with a slight advantage. There are some false paths for white in the first continuation I looked at, with the queen takes h1 check, king e2, rook e4 check, king d2, and queen takes g2. At this position, for example, I mean it's a wrong continuation, but it looks like it might be right. Like queen takes a5 check, and king b8, queen to d8 check, king a7, king c2, bishop e7, queen b6 check, king b8, and rook d7 with mate threats. But it fails after rook to e2 check, which would then be followed by bishop falling on b2 with check, and black having a mating attack in about 20 moves or something like that. I'll run through it quickly just to show you. Say king b3, then rook takes b2 check, king takes b2, queen takes f2 check, king b3, queen e3 check, king c2, queen e4, king d1, queen g4 check, king d2, queen g2 check, king e1, bishop h4 check, king d1, queen f1 check. A lot of dancing around, but it is gradually achieving something. Queen c1 check, king b3, queen b1 check, king c3, bishop f6 check, king d2, queen b2 check, king e3, queen c3 check, and now we're getting somewhere. Queen c4 check, king d1, queen b3 check, king d2, bishop g5 check, king e2, queen e6 check, and the rook's falling. King f1, queen takes d7, and here white would gain a tempo, but there's nothing he can do really. His queen is completely trapped behind its own pawns. So say for example king g2, then queen d2 check, and after king h3, queen f2. It's mate m4. But Duckstein could have avoided these continuations, and playing queen d3 at move 21 here was definitely his best chance. Although the b pawn is under attack here, his best bet would be simply to abandon it in favour of getting a better position as a whole. Centralized pieces are good counterattack and good counterattacking chances, especially considering the temporary lack of coordination between black's pieces, and his exposed king would have been more than enough compensation for the pawn. Okay, that's the end of part 2.